From as far back as the 17th century, children, some as young as 3 years old, were shipped overseas from Great Britain. It was seen as the ideal solution to social problems at home and welcomed by countries that needed cheap labour and to boost population. Despite conditions in the UK improving for children after the Second World War, the practice continued. There were a few lucky ones that survived, but the vast majority were neglected and treated like slaves in brutal institutions which scarred them for life. Well, one of those boys is Nigel Owen, and he's here to share his story with us. It's great to have you on the show, Nigel.
Hello, good afternoon, Selena. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. Now, you very bravely put your story into a book called Stolen Innocence, Memoirs of a Child Migrant, and I believe you were sent to Australia.
Yeah, I was sent to Australia in 1955 to the Northcote Farm School. I was age 5 at the time with my brother and sister. My brother was 11 and my sister was 10 at the time, and it was a life of, it was horrendous brutality, abuse virtually on a daily basis. Sexual abuse was rampant there. It was unbelievable, and it scarred me, my sister and brother for life.
I'm sure. Well, if we can go back to the very beginning, so you said you were 5 in 55, so you were born in 1950, and you were born in Ramsgate, weren't you, in Kent?
I was born in Ramsgate in Kent, yes. My birth father was in the RAF. He was a mechanic for the Air Force, and a lot of the history about it I didn't find out until long after his death and my mother's death, because I've been trying to find all the information, but it was virtually impossible to get. But it came to light that the relationship between my mother and father was very, very bad. He used to beat on her all the time, and we were always involved with social services and things like that. At the time I was quite young, so my memory of it isn't that great. But my sister, she saw exactly what went on a daily basis as well. And I think my mother sought to help us and get us out of that environment. And she found out about the child migrant system. And we were sent to Australia, but unbeknown, I think, to her, she didn't realise she was sending us from a bad environment at home to a worse environment in Australia.
It's so sad. You were supposed to be sent to a more safe place, and it was a worse place, as you say.
Oh, it was. You know, it was like, because we were sent out, we ended up in by the Fairbridge organisation. We were shipped out via them, and we were sent to one of their centres in Northcote in Kent, where we stayed for a couple of days, and then we were then shipped out on the Strathnaver with, I think there must have been a total of 30, 40 kids all going to various places in Australia. 7 of us on the trip all ended up in the Northcote Farm School, and the others ended up in different places, Malong over in Western Australia. And literally the day I arrived, I remember it like yesterday, in 1955, we were picked up and transported from the docks in Melbourne to a place called Bacchus Marsh over in Glenmore. And by the time we got there, it was late at night, and I was falling, because I was only 5 years of age, and I was falling asleep. And there had food been left out for us, but I was falling asleep totally. And the woman that was meant to look after us, I was woken up with a beating on the legs. And that was my first day there, or first evening there. My sister tried to protect me, but she got beaten as well. And from that day on, it was just horrendous. It was virtually on a daily basis. We were treated like slaves. And the abuse we got, it's just unbelievable. You can't really describe it. And I spent most of my life trying to explain this to myself, let alone others. And when I tried to speak to people, they wouldn't believe me.
Oh, that makes it 10 times worse, doesn't it?
They were thinking, oh, God, people wouldn't do that to you. People wouldn't send you to Oz. But it was a secret hidden by the British government for centuries, basically, wasn't it? Because it's far back as, what was it? I think it's 1680 when the child migration from the inception was started, when the first group of about 100 children were emigrated from UK to Richmond, Virginia, in the US. And then in the early part of the 19th century, about 440 children were sent to South Africa as substitutes for the slave labour, which had recently been abolished. It was only after, I think it was about 1850, amendments to the Poor Laws in the UK, that the practice became an institution. And then approximately 100,000 children were shipped to Canada between 1899 and 1967. And the majority of these children were employed in rural areas, the boys as farmhands and the girls as domestic servants. Then I think it was about 280 children were then shipped to Rhodesia between 1946 and 56. And then a further 500 were sent to New Zealand around about the same period. Estimates of the numbers sent to Australia vary. It's unbelievable. It was said that around about 6,500 arrived in Australia between 1912 and 67. But the House and Commons did a report and states that between, I think, 47 and 67, between 70,000 and 100,000 children were sent to Australia. And that included, I think, kids over the age of 16 as well.
And when you arrived at Northcote School, you weren't split up from your brother and sister, they were with you?
My sister and I, because what it was, the farm school was a load of cottages. And my sister and myself were in one cottage. And my brother, because he was older, was sent to another cottage. So we were all basically together, which was lucky because a lot of the children who were shipped out were split up, and they were told that their parents were dead. They had no idea, and some of them even had their names changed. So they couldn't trace their history even in later years, you see.
And the lady, the person, the woman, who beat you straight away for not eating and falling asleep, was that Humphreys?
It was Humphreys. Excuse my language, what a cow she was.
Sounds like it.
She was such a nasty piece of work. She used to pick on us. Now, in those days, when kids are having a hard time, you wet the bed, and that can't be helped because, you're in a bad environment. And I wasn't the only one. Myself and most of the kids in the same dorm I was in used to do it. And we were awakened at about 5 o'clock in the morning. We were then beaten because we had wet the bed and then had to parade our wet sheets down the centre of the dormitory. We then had to wash them in a bucket, take them outside and hang them up. This is 5 o'clock in the morning. We had to drag our mattresses outside to dry on the veranda. We then were punished. We had to go round behind the house and chop wood. Literally, and I'm talking, I was 5, 6 years of age.
That's ridiculous.
And it was unbelievable. And this Humphreys was such a bitter woman. We were never allowed to have hot baths. And because we were so small, the old-fashioned double sinks you get in like a draining one, we had to bath in those. But we were allowed 3 inches of cold water. That was it. And never had a hot bath there at all. The only time I had a warm bath was when there was an inspector sent out by the UK government in 1955, 56, I think it was. I had no idea at the time who this man was, and I was actually about to get in to have a bath with the cold water, and he walked in, and he saw me, and he says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm pouring a bath." So he turned the hot tap on, so I had a hot So hot water went in, and that was the first and only hot bath I had in 5 years.
Oh,
After he left, I got another beating for doing that. It was just unbelievable. And in the end, you used to cry in the beginning. In the end, you just didn't cry. You just took your beating and put up with it, and that was it.
Well, I'm not surprised you remember what you're remembering because, like you say, these things can scar people for lives. But I read that there was a couple of nice people. One was Mrs. Hemingway.
Yeah, what the situation was there was you're in the farm school, and during what they call the summer period, you used to be sent out, or used to get families or people used to come, and we used to be put in the hall of the farm school. There was like a big dining hall there, and we used to get these people used to come, and they used to select you literally. Oh, well, I have him, have her, this, or whatever. And luckily, this Mrs. Hemingway picked me, and she lived in North Baldwin, just outside Melbourne, and she was a lovely lady, and she was my mother, and she never hurt me. She treated me well, and my life changed just with her. She gave me the security that I think I needed. But I also, I like to mention that when we all went out to us, any personal possessions were taken off us. But I managed, would you believe, to keep my teddy called Hector. Now, when I got there, everyone else had their stuff taken, and me, I suppose, being a little bit devious, I managed to keep mine, and I hid it. And I used to keep it underneath the cottage or in the garden, whatever. And I have still got it to this day.
Oh, wow.
So what it was, I think, with Hector, my teddy, he was my little comfort blanket. He wouldn't hurt me or whatever.
Oh.
So he helped me through the whole situation, if you can understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
And many years later, when I actually went to the apology in Westminster in 2010 to meet Gordon Brown, the then Prime Minister, Hector came with me.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, tell us about that, because you campaigned for an apology, which, as you say, you got in 2010.
Yeah, well, for years, I was trying to get information about what happened to me and and it was impossible. I'd written to the Australian authorities, and back in those days, you got nowhere. You wrote a letter, and if you got a reply, you'd be lucky. But then the internet came. What a difference. That opened up a whole new world. And I'd started campaigning, back in the mid-90s for an apology for us, It was, I just got my teeth into it, and I thought, to hell with it. And I was getting absolutely nowhere. I'd written to newspapers over and over again, and they weren't interested. It was a story that, in their eyes, wasn't worth telling, and who would believe that, a government would send thousands of kids to a life of abuse and brutality, would they? But eventually, long after, in 2009, when the Australian government apologised, that opened up a new can of worms, and then my campaign started to get momentum. And then a year later, the UK government apologised back in February in 2010, and I was invited by Gordon Brown to the actual apology. And I took Hector with me, and he actually did listen to me. You know, politicians, you take them with a pinch of salt. But he actually did listen to me, which, it felt good. And I've always been putting pen to paper for many years. But when that happened, I thought, right, now, people will believe me. I was going through a stage when I was thinking if I imagined it all, because people wouldn't believe what I was saying.
No, that's
but then I started really putting the book together, and it literally took me nearly 20 years, would you believe?
Blimey.
With research, and it was only we were repatriated. My mother eventually got us back, and we were repatriated back to Britain in 1959, but my God, that didn't go well.
Really?
We ended up, my sister was running wild, my brother as well, because they were older than me and they had as much abuse, but I think they got more than I did because they were older and it was more vicious. And my brother and sister were just running amok, and I ended back in care again with social services in the UK, on about 4 occasions. And I then started getting into trouble myself. You know, I was going to school. We were living in Ilford in Essex, and I was attending school there when I was 9. But my education was terrible because in Oz it wasn't very good either. And because my mother and my soon-to-be adopted father, who adopted me, were both working, so I used to get up in the mornings and go to school by myself at the age of 9, come home from school by myself, make myself my tea or my supper, and I used to go out. And I started getting into trouble and all this lot, and before long I ended up in court, and I ended up being sent away to a reformatory, you know, for theft. And that was all I realised now was a cry for help.
Of course, yeah, well, after what you've been through, yeah. Well, it's a fascinating story, a very sad story, but you have come out the other side, which is wonderful. Just to let our listeners know, the book is called Stolen Innocence, Memoirs of a Child Migrant, and it's by Nigel Owen, who we're speaking to now. And you can actually buy it from our website by going on to tre.radio. Nigel, it's been lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much for being brave enough to share your story.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Okay, all the best. Bye
all
now.
The best. Bye-bye.
Bye.